The wind in northern Minnesota wasn't just cold. It had teeth. It whipped across the frozen fields, howling like a chorus of ghosts, rattling the shutters of a dozen small cabins huddled against the edge of the pines. For most, it was enough to stay indoors and wait it out. But for Will Carson, wind was the kind of challenge you stared down and refused to yield to. Will's cabin sat on the far edge of the ridge, where the forest thinned and the prairie spread out like a white, unbroken sea. The previous owners had left it modest, barely more than a one-room shack with a sloping roof and a stubborn little fireplace. But to Will, who'd grown up on tales of self-reliance and survival told by his grandfather over a flickering lantern, it was a sanctuary, a place where the world couldn't tell him who to be. His neighbors, though, well, they had other ideas. It had started with a stack of firewood. Will had spent the better part of a week collecting fallen branches and chunks of lumber from the surrounding forest, splitting logs with his father's old maul, until he had enough to build a second wall outside his cabin. Not a wall for decoration or property, just a row of wood he thought might block the sharpest gusts from sneaking under his roof eaves. He called it his windbreaker, and he was proud of it. The first time anyone saw it, they laughed. "Looks like you're stockpiling for the apocalypse, Carson," Marty Jenkins had hollered from his truck, shaking his head with a grin. Marty lived 2 cabins down, always with a beer in one hand and a sarcastic comment on the tip of his tongue. "Yeah, man, you gonna start a bonfire wall?" called another neighbor, Linda Cooper, perched on her porch like a queen surveying her frozen kingdom. Her laugh carried across the snow like sharp glass. Will had just smiled, nodded, and kept stacking. "Just wait," he said under his breath, though he wasn't entirely sure who he was speaking to, himself, maybe, or the wind. By the second week, the laughter had become outright mockery. Kids from the neighborhood sledding down the hill waved at the cabin and made exaggerated, "Oh no," faces as they pointed at the wall. Dogs barked at it. Even the wind seemed to mock him, catching the uneven piles and whistling through them in unpredictable ways. "Why don't you just spend your energy fixing that old cabin instead of building some weird log fence?" Marty asked one morning, leaning over the tailgate of his truck as Will carefully adjusted a stubborn piece of oak that refused to stay upright. "Because," Will said, wiping sweat and a smear of bark dust from his forehead, "this wall keeps the heat from my stove inside. You can call it dumb, but it works." Marty laughed, the kind of laugh that carries a mix of amusement and disbelief. "Man, you're lucky that thing isn't tipping over in a gust. You'd be buried in your own firewood." Will's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure the wall would hold up either, but the idea of being cold and miserable every winter had been enough to drive him this far. He worked in silence, stacking, measuring, adjusting. The nights in Minnesota were merciless. By sundown, temperatures had already dipped well below zero, and the wind carried through every tiny gap in the cabin's old wood like a fleet of tiny daggers. Will had tried patching, caulking, even hanging blankets over windows, but heat still slipped away as if the walls themselves were bleeding warmth. He remembered his grandfather's voice, calm and firm, sitting on the porch with a pipe and a knitted blanket draped over his knees. "You don't just fight the wind," he had said once. "You trick it, make it work for you, not against you." So that was what he was doing. Each log in the wall wasn't just a piece of wood. It was a puzzle piece, a little trap for the wind, something to redirect it, slow it down, force it to swirl around the cabin instead of through it. At night, when he'd finished stacking, he would stand back, hands on hips, and imagine the invisible currents bending to his design. Most nights he was alone. Sometimes he heard footsteps in the snow, neighbors wandering down trails to check on their own cabins. They never approached the wall, never said anything beyond muffled chuckles. Will didn't mind. He preferred solitude anyway. Solitude let him think, plan, and work without commentary. But one night, a particularly fierce gust tore across the ridge. Will was in the cabin, eating canned beans heated over the stove, when he heard a crack that made his stomach tighten. The wall had shifted. He ran outside in boots stiff with ice, gripping the shovel he kept by the door. The wind whipped snow into his face, stinging eyes and skin alike. He reached the wall and found a stack of logs leaning dangerously. For a moment he froze, thinking of all the neighbors who would see this and shake their heads. But then stubbornness took over. No, he muttered, why? Anking the logs back into place, wedging them tighter. Not tonight. By the time he finished, his arms ached, fingers were raw, and his face was frozen into a grim mask. He stood back and looked at the wall. It wasn't perfect, but it was standing. He could feel the difference already. The wind, while still roaring, no longer cut straight through the little gap by his back porch. It deflected, swirled, and died in little eddies against the wood. The next morning, when Marty drove by, he didn't laugh. He slowed down, squinting at the cabin. Did that wall do something? He asked cautiously. Will just nodded. Kept the stove's heat in last night. I didn't have to wake up shivering. Marty's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to say something, probably another jab, but nothing came out. He just drove off. It was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, Will's stubbornness might pay off. But the true test would come a week later, when a blizzard was forecasted. A storm so brutal the local news warned people to stay indoors, to hunker down and ration their firewood. Most cabins would shiver through it. Will, though, had a secret weapon. As he watched the first flakes begin to fall, light as ash at first, he ran his hands over the wall. Every log, every notch, every little shim of scrap wood jammed into gaps. He'd done it all himself. And if the wind really came like it was supposed to, he thought, his cabin might just stay warm enough that he could sleep without waking up frozen solid. Even as the flakes thickened into sheets of white, the neighbors stayed inside, their cabin doors barely cracking against the storm. Only Will was outside, adjusting, tightening, bracing the wall against gusts that screamed across the ridge. Snow piled up against the wood, heavy, relentless, but the wall didn't yield. He worked until his fingers were numb, the cold biting through mittens and jacket alike. By nightfall, the storm had fully arrived. Wind howled like a pack of wolves, and snow drifted so high that the cabin looked like it was swallowed by a white tide. Will lit the stove, checked the wall one more time, and stepped back to watch. He felt the warmth wash over him almost immediately, the difference between inside and outside stark as a brick wall in the cold. And in that moment, standing alone in the blizzard, he allowed himself a small, victorious smile. Maybe the neighbors had mocked him, laughed at his obsession. But in the face of the storm, his stubborn, ridiculous little wall was the difference between misery and comfort. Still, he knew the storm wasn't done yet, and he knew that the wind, cunning and relentless, would keep testing his creation. But for the first time, he felt hope. The storm raged on, and Will watched it, alert and ready, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges, but also knowing that he'd already taken the first step toward triumph. The morning after the blizzard was like stepping into a world that had been scrubbed clean, only harsher. Snow covered everything in a blinding white, draped over trees, cars, and cabins like a thick quilt. Icicles hung from roofs like frozen daggers, glittering in the weak winter sun. Most neighbors hadn't left their homes yet, huddled inside, nursing coffee and worry. But Will Carson, he was already outside, inspecting his wall. The storm had battered it all night, rattling and groaning like an old beast testing his defenses. Yet miraculously, the structure had survived. Some logs had shifted slightly, but nothing critical. The snow had piled up against it, pressing like a silent ally, forming an almost natural windbreak that funneled the gusts away from the cabin walls. Will ran his gloved hands along the top of the logs, brushing snow away. The satisfaction in his chest was a quiet warmth, almost intoxicating compared to the frigid air. For the first time, he felt vindicated, not just in the cold, but against every scoff, every mocking comment, every sideways glance from the neighbors. And then he heard it, the crunch of tires on packed snow. Marty Jenkins rolled up in his old Ford pickup, the exhaust puffing like steam from a kettle. He slowed near the cabin, squinting through the glare of the snow, clearly trying to figure out what to say. His usual smirk was gone. "Looks different," Marty said finally, voice tight, almost unsure. Will just nodded, brushing more snow off his coat. "It works, kept the heat in all night. I didn't wake up frozen once." Marty's eyes flicked toward the cabin, then back to the wall. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick as the snowdrifts around. Then Marty leaned on the hood of his truck, scratching his jaw. "Oh, well, I guess good job, man." Will shrugged a little awkwardly. Thanks, took a lot of work, but he didn't finish. The truth was obvious. The wall had saved him from the storm. That was reward enough. Word traveled fast in a small, tight-knit community, especially one buried. Under a blizzard, by mid-morning, more neighbors began peeking out, trudging across snowbanks to see for themselves. Whispered comments passed from porch to porch. Some were skeptical, some curious, but all were watching Will's cabin, the little wall holding firm. "Didn't think he'd make it through the storm," Linda Cooper said as she finally emerged from her porch, boots crunching through fresh snow. She adjusted her scarf, eyes narrowing on the wood. "Looks like that thing actually works." Will just smiled faintly, exhausted but proud. "Told you, sometimes the stubborn ideas are the ones that pay off." By noon, a small crowd had gathered, neighbors staring in quiet awe. Will had never sought attention, and yet here it was. His crazy wall had become a point of curiosity, almost admiration. Some of the neighbors had even brought tools and scraps of wood, muttering about reinforcing their own cabins against the next storm. But Will didn't care about accolades. He was focused on the wind, on the cold, on the way the snow piled up against the cabin in perfect harmony with his design. Every gust that struck the wall now deflected around the cabin, curling in eddies that the old fireplace could easily manage. He could feel the warmth lingering in the cabin like a living thing. And yet, pride has a way of bringing unexpected challenges. That evening, as Will settled by the stove with a mug of strong coffee, he heard a strange creak. At first, he ignored it. The cabin groaned in the cold all the time, old wood, frost, shifting foundations. But then came another creak, sharper, deliberate, almost as if someone were testing him. Will's eyes narrowed. He grabbed the lantern, its warm glow cutting a path through the dark, and stepped outside. The wind had died down, but the snow had formed high banks along the wall, burying some of the lower logs. At first, nothing seemed amiss, but then he noticed a small shadow moving along the far side of the ridge. "Who's there?" he called, voice firm but cautious. No answer, just the whisper of snow and the soft crunch of boots, or maybe paws on ice. Will's heart rate picked up. Wolves sometimes wandered close this far north, and the storm could have displaced them. He tightened his grip on the shovel and crept toward the shadow, trying to make himself as big as possible, trying to look fearless. A figure emerged from the trees, arms raised slightly, holding nothing. It was a man, tall, bundled in layers of flannel and snow-dusted jackets, looking disoriented and tired. Will blinked. "Marty?" he asked, surprised. The man nodded, shivering violently. "IUH truck got stuck. Thought I'd try walking back, but got lost in the storm." Relief washed over Will. "Come on inside, get warm." He led Marty to the cabin, letting him brush off snow and thaw by the stove. The fire crackled, the air thick with the scent of pine and melting snow. Marty stared at the wall from inside, still in awe. "I didn't think it'd hold all that wood. You weren't joking." Will smiled, rubbing his hands together. "Sometimes it's not about joking. It's about doing what's necessary, even if it looks ridiculous to everyone else." Marty chuckled, shivering but grateful. "Guess I've been looking at it all wrong. Might need one of those walls myself before the next storm." Will laughed, a deep, genuine sound that filled the cabin. "Better start stacking then. Won't wait for me to do it for you." That night, after Marty had gone home, Will sat by the stove, thinking about the events of the past few days. The storm had been merciless, the work exhausting, but there was something more profound happening. His stubbornness, his refusal to bow to mockery, had not only kept him warm, but had quietly shifted the perception of the neighbors. For the first time, he felt a subtle sense of respect from the community. Not the loud, bragging kind, but the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes grit and foresight mattered more than appearances. He drifted off to sleep that night with the warmth of the cabin embracing him, snow piled high against the wall, the wind howling harmlessly outside. The victory was small, silent, but it was his. The next morning, however, brought a new realization. The storm had uncovered weaknesses, small gaps in the wall where the snow had shifted logs. If left unattended, those gaps could turn into channels for wind, undoing all of Will's hard work. The neighbors, now curious and impressed, had started offering help and advice, each suggestion carrying a subtle undertone of criticism. Will felt the familiar twinge of frustration. He wasn't building a monument to please anyone. He was fighting the wind, day by day, log by log, and yet he realized this was a battle that could no longer be waged entirely alone. By noon, he had made a plan. He would reinforce the wall, secure it against future storms, and maybe, just maybe, allow the neighbors to witness the process. Not for their approval, but to prove to himself that he could take their skepticism, their mockery, and turn it into something stronger, something that worked, no matter who believed in it or not. And as he stepped outside, hammer in hand, snow packed around his boots, Will Carson felt a renewed determination. The blizzard had tested him and in its own harsh way had given him confidence. The wall had survived. He had survived. And now he was ready for the next challenge. Winter in northern Minnesota was no joke, and by the time mid-January rolled around, the ridge where Will's cabin stood had become a fortress of snow and ice. The sun barely rose over the horizon, and when it did, it cast a pale, icy light over the world. Every day felt like a battle against the cold, and every night brought a new round of howling winds that seemed to conspire against warmth itself. Will Carson was ready. His wall, now reinforced with extra logs and secured with old nails and metal brackets he scavenged from a nearby barn, had become a formidable barrier. It wasn't perfect. Some logs were uneven, some shivered with the cold, but it worked. The difference inside the cabin was remarkable. Where neighbors woke shivering, Will woke to a steady, comforting warmth that made the mornings almost pleasant. It wasn't long, though, before the wall attracted more attention. Not just casual glances or skeptical whispers. This time, neighbors started to watch more closely, curious and cautious in equal measure. Marty Jenkins, now openly admiring, even stopped by with a thermos of coffee one morning. "Man, I don't know how you did it," Marty admitted, peering over the top of the wall. "All that snow last week, that thing held up like it was meant to." Will just shrugged. "Told you. It's about thinking ahead, paying attention to the wind, not just the snow. You can't fight it, you gotta work with it." Marty shook his head in disbelief. "Yeah, well, most of us are too busy laughing at the guy who stacks logs outside his cabin." Will smiled faintly but said nothing. He had grown used to being the odd one out. He didn't mind. What mattered was what worked, not what looked good in the eyes of others. The true test came on a Friday night, when the weather forecast predicted the worst storm of the season. Locals called it the Ice King. Winds strong enough to bend trees and snow deep enough to bury cars halfway to their roofs. Most residents were barricading themselves inside, rationing firewood, preparing for a night of frozen misery. Will, however, was ready. He had been preparing for this storm for weeks. Every log in his wall was checked, every gap filled with wood scraps, and every bracket tightened. Inside, the stove roared like a beast, radiating heat that pooled in the corners and crept up the walls. Will stepped back, listening to the wind rise outside, and felt the satisfaction that only comes from knowing you've built something that can survive the worst. The storm hit like a hammer. Snow flew in horizontal sheets, driven by gusts that ripped through even the sturdiest fences and trees. Will watched from his window, the firelight reflecting off the snow, feeling the wall shake slightly under the pressure. But it held. Hours passed. The wind screamed, snow piled higher, and the temperature plunged further into the negative. Still, inside the cabin, Will was warm, not just warm, safe. Then came the unexpected. A loud crack echoed outside, followed by a roar of snow cascading down the ridge. Will grabbed his lantern and ran outside, heart hammering. The top of a tree from the nearby forest had fallen, uprooted by the wind, and landed dangerously close to his wall. If it hit, it could knock over the structure and send logs crashing into the cabin. Will didn't hesitate. Boots crunching through snow, he grabbed a long, thick branch and used it as a lever, shoving against the fallen tree and trying to push it off the wall. It was heavy, far heavier than he anticipated, but he refused to quit. Each shove felt like lifting the weight of the winter itself. Finally, with a grunting heave, he managed to roll the tree just enough so it didn't strike the wall. Snow poured over him, melting into his coat and dripping down his face, but the wall remained upright, unscathed. Will stood there, panting, covered in snow, staring at the handiwork that had just saved the day. By morning, the storm had passed. Snowdrifts were taller than cabins, fences buried, and most roads impassable. But the little ridge, Will's cabin, and his stubborn wall were untouched. Neighbors who emerged to assess the damage found themselves staring at the structure in stunned silence. Linda Cooper was among the first to approach. She adjusted her scarf, eyes wide. I can't believe it," she said. "Every other cabin around here, half the roofs are crushed or buried. Yours is fine." Will wiped snow off his boots and simply said, "It's not magic, just planning and a lot of work." Even Artie, who had been there almost constantly, shaking his head in disbelief, finally had no words. He could only nod. The attention, however, brought its own challenges. Neighbors, now genuinely impressed, began to suggest modifications, offer advice, and in some cases, subtly question whether Will was doing enough. It was frustrating. He didn't need input, he needed to act, but the situation demanded diplomacy. Over the next few days, Will found himself explaining the wall to anyone who asked. He talked about wind patterns, snow load, and the importance of preparation. Some listened, genuinely curious, others skeptical. But all noticed one thing: the heat inside his cabin was unmatched, and the wall had proven itself against the storm. Then came the moment that cemented his place in the community. A small group of children, the same ones who had sledded past his cabin weeks before, came trudging through the snow to play. One little girl, face red from the cold, stopped in front of the wall and stared. "Is it true it keeps the cabin warm?" she asked. Will knelt down to her level. "Yep, even in the worst storms, the heat stays inside. That's why I built it." The children exchanged odd glances, then ran back to tell their parents. By the end of the day, neighbors were no longer mocking the wall. They were discussing it seriously, asking questions about construction, about logs, about planning. What had been a joke was now a topic of admiration. For Will, the transformation was subtle but profound. He had always been an outsider in a world that valued appearances over results. But now, his persistence, his stubbornness, and his willingness to endure mockery had not only protected him, it had earned respect. And yet, beneath the pride, a seed of concern grew. Nature, after all, had more tests in store. The ridge, the snow, the ice, all of it could turn against him at any moment. He knew that storms would come again, stronger, smarter, and more relentless. So he continued working day by day, reinforcing the wall, monitoring the wind, adjusting logs, and preparing for the future. It wasn't glory he sought, it was survival. But somewhere deep down, he also realized that survival, when paired with determination and ingenuity, could become something greater. By the time February rolled around, Will Carson's wall had become more than a structure. It was a symbol, a testament to resilience, foresight, and the quiet power of stubbornness. And as he stepped outside one evening, watching the last light of the sun glint off snow and wood, he felt a fierce satisfaction. He had fought the wind, he had endured mockery, and he had won. February in northern Minnesota was relentless. The ridge where Will Carson's cabin sat had become a kingdom of ice and snow, carved and reshaped by the wind like a sculptor with no mercy. Most of the neighbors were barely leaving their homes, rationing food, stacking firewood in preparation for the weeks ahead. But Will, he moved like a man who had made peace with the storm. Every footstep in the snow was deliberate, every glance at the wall measured and confident. The blizzards had left their mark on the land. Trees were bent under the weight of frost, roofs groaned under packed snow, and narrow lanes were impassable without serious effort. Yet Will's cabin, tucked behind his second wall of firewood, remained a bastion of warmth. Inside, the stove's heat spread like liquid gold, cutting through the cold and making the cabin feel alive, almost protective. By now, the neighbors' perspective had shifted entirely. What once drew snickers and whispered jokes now drew curiosity, and even envy. Marty Jenkins had become a frequent visitor, offering to help with repairs, braving the cold for a glimpse of the interior warmth. Linda Cooper, who had once laughed openly at Will's ridiculous project, stopped by almost daily to bring baked goods and share advice she'd picked up from decades of winter living. "You know, Carson," Marty said one afternoon, brushing snow from his shoulders, "I don't know why I doubted you. That wall saved my stove last week. The wind didn't even touch my porch. Will laughed softly. Told you, it's all about working with the wind, not against it. But the true test came during the fiercest storm yet. A snowstorm that rolled in faster than the weather reports had predicted. Wind gusts ripped across the ridge at 50, 60 miles per hour, snow spiraling like a blizzard from another world. Cabin doors rattled, shutters shivered, and every other structure in the neighborhood seemed to groan under the relentless pressure. Will, however, was ready. He had spent weeks reinforcing the wall further, wedging in extra logs, tightening brackets, and shimming gaps with scrap wood. He lit the stove before the storm hit, checking every corner, every draft, until the cabin hummed with comforting warmth. Hours passed. The wind screamed, ice rattled on the roof, and snow piled high. But the wall held. Gust after gust crashed into it, only to curl harmlessly around the cabin, never penetrating. Inside, the air remained warm, the fire steady, the cabin alive with the quiet triumph of preparation. Late into the night, a sudden crack made Will tense. A large branch, loosened by the wind, had fallen against the outer layer of his wall. Heart pounding, he grabbed his lantern and ran outside, the storm lashing against his face. Snow whipped into his eyes, cold biting through every layer of clothing, but he didn't hesitate. Using his shovel as a lever, he nudged the branch away from the structure, bracing it just enough so the logs didn't shift. The wall groaned under the pressure but didn't yield. Exhausted, soaked, and covered in snow, Will stood back and exhaled slowly. The storm raged on around him, but for a brief moment he felt invincible. Every hour of labor, every piece of firewood stacked, every skeptical glance from neighbors, all of it had led to this. The wall had survived not just the storm, but the test of patience, of persistence, of belief in something others didn't understand. By dawn, the blizzard began to relent, leaving the world outside carved in shimmering ice and pure, untouched snow. Will's cabin emerged like a fortress, the walls still standing unbowed and unbroken. The neighbors began to venture out, blinking against the sun's glare and the expanse of snow. One by one, they approached, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and awe. Linda Cooper was the first to speak. "Will, that thing saved your cabin," she said softly, almost reverently. "And maybe it saved the heat for you too. Everyone else is shivering. Look at their roofs, their porches, yours." Will smiled, brushing snow from his coat. "It's not magic," he said quietly. "Just a lot of planning and stubbornness. You keep at it and it works." Marty Jenkins clapped him on the shoulder, laughing with relief and admiration. "Stubborn is right. I've seen a lot of walls in my day, Carson, but nothing like this. You made it through the worst storm of the season while the rest of us were frozen solid. Man, that's impressive." Word of Will's wall spread beyond the ridge. By mid-morning, a small group of neighbors had gathered, inspecting the structure, asking questions, and taking notes. Children pointed excitedly at the carefully stacked logs, parents marveled at the ingenuity, and even the quietest neighbors nodded in approval. Will had gone from the cabin everyone mocked to the cabin everyone looked up to. But the real triumph wasn't the admiration. It was the warmth, the security, the proof that persistence, patience, and careful planning could overcome ridicule, fear, and nature itself. That night, as Will sat by the stove, sipping coffee and listening to the gentle crackle of the fire, he reflected on the journey. The wall had been more than just a structure. It had been a testament to resilience, a shield against the storm, and a quiet declaration that perseverance mattered more than appearances. Each log represented effort, foresight, and the courage to do something even when everyone else thought it was foolish. And there, in the warmth of the cabin, surrounded by snow and silence, Will felt a deep, unshakable sense of peace. The wind might howl, the snow might fall, and the world might continue to test him. But he had proven something to himself that no mockery could erase. That preparation, stubbornness, and belief in one's own vision could triumph against even the harshest odds. By the next morning, the ridge was still blanketed in white, the sun glinting off the pristine landscape. Neighbors emerged cautiously, but this time their steps carried respect rather than skepticism. Marty and Linda stopped by, smiling, bringing extra firewood and warm drinks. They didn't mock, they didn't tease. They simply acknowledged the man who had turned a ridiculous idea into a life-saving reality. Will Carson stood by the wall, letting the sun glint off the snow and logs, feeling the warmth of the cabin seep into his bones. The ridge stretched out before him, vast, white, and untouched, and for the first time he felt completely in command, not just of his little cabin, but of his place in the world. The wind howled in the distance, but it no longer carried fear. It carried respect. It carried triumph, and for Will Carson that was more than enough. He turned back toward the cabin, stacking one last log in place, and allowed himself a small, quiet smile. The wall was finished, not just in structure, but in meaning. It had endured, and so had he. Outside, the snow glimmered. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth, and for the first time, Will didn't have to fight the cold alone. He had built something that mattered, something strong, something lasting. The storm had passed, and Will Carson had won.